Hi, everyone. Welcome to part two on microcredit. In part one, linked below, we talked about how microcredit solved the problem of lending to the poor at relatively low rates. We also talked about the evidence for positive but modest effects that microcredit has on beneficiary households. In this video, we'll talk about a puzzling finding from the first 7 systematic and rigorous experiments on microcredit that we already referred to in part one. We'll also talk about who stands to benefit the most from microcredit. So let's pick up from where we left off in part one. From the experiments on microcredit, we know that it looks like very few eligible households are taking up the microcredit offer, which is surprising, given that most of these households have to rely on alternate sources that charge a much higher interest rate. Why not take advantage of a source with lower cost of credit? We will have to think carefully about this. I have faith in us, which is hopefully not misplaced. So the literature talks about different answers to this problem. Here are some that I find compelling. So the first thing is the group structure. So people who don't like interfering in other people's business may not feel comfortable joining the microcredit setting, or people like me who don't want others to poke their noses in my business. Also, the entire process is very time consuming, beginning with screening, forming groups, and holding weekly meetings. And time is just not a resource that the poor has in abundance, unless you happen to be a poor time lord. But here's the reason that I find the most compelling. It turns out that the two features of microcredit that lowers the interest rate that we talked about in part one, peer monitoring and joint liability, these two will also lead to over-conservative choice of projects. And it might not be conducive for everyone out there with the different business plans that they might have. So Fischer carried out a neat laboratory experiment to demonstrate that there are a couple of very large inefficiencies embedded in the typical microcredit contract, particularly when you have joint liability with almost perfect monitoring. These contracts will lead to choosing projects that are less risky and hence has less returns. And this might also be why running a business with microcredit is not going to lead to transformative effects and might not help the average household to escape the poverty trap, despite some of the many success stories that we hear about. So here's a simple and helpful picture from the Poor Economics book by Duflo and Banerjee, which might help to illustrate this intuition. So on the x-axis, we have the total amount of investment in a given business, and on the y-axis, we have the returns or size of that business. Most businesses will look something like the OZ curve. So while their marginal returns will decrease at some point with higher investment, they will keep growing. Unfortunately, most of the businesses run by the poor may end up looking something like the OP curve. They might grow a lot at the beginning with an additional dollar of investment when investments are zero or very little, but the growth potential tapers off very fast. These are small, undifferentiated businesses operating in places without a lot of purchasing power. And while there is room for aggressive growth at the beginning, it might quickly taper out, and therefore it might not really allow them to escape the poverty trap. And this might be why, despite some wonderful success stories, microcredit might not actually be very effective at alleviating poverty wholesale, while still being a great way to lower the cost of credit for some of the poor. Incidentally, this also answers the second question that we began the part one video with. This is why businesses run by the poor are often able to sustain very high repayment rates when overall investment is small, but they simply cannot keep doing that once the investment crosses a certain threshold. So can the typical microcredit contract be improved? Indubitably, as it turns out. One experiment by Kinnan and Karlan showed that you do not really need the joint liability feature to keep default rates low. All you need are weekly meetings to gain trust, to share issues in your business and hear about other people's experiences, and some financial education. This will continue to keep the default rates low while hopefully removing the binding constraint of having to stick to super conservative projects because you know that you're accountable to all of the other members in your group financially, and they're exerting a lot of effort to monitor what you're up to. Also, it helps when you add a grace period to individually liable microfinance loans, during which no interest payments are due. So this differs from the typical experience of a microfinance borrower who has to repay certain amounts every 2 weeks or every 1 week in a very rigid manner. If this requirement is lifted, it looks like business investment and profits go up and decreases non-business loan use. So in that case, borrowers are less likely to spend the money behind their own consumption and more likely to invest in their businesses. But there is a catch. There is still a trade-off. With this type of a stipulation, often default rate goes up, and in fact, it was 3 times as high in the treatment group as opposed to the control group. This might be why some microcredit institutions might be reluctant to take this on within their contract. But there is a trade-off. You might have some businesses benefit a lot from this stipulation, while overall default rates might also go up. So who stands to benefit the most from microcredit? It's people that economists flamboyantly call gung-ho entrepreneurs. So gung-ho entrepreneurs are people who had resolved to be entrepreneurs even before they had any access to microcredit and can thus benefit from a cheaper source of credit once microcredit is indeed introduced in their villages or in their neighborhoods. They are different from people who decide to become entrepreneurs only because suddenly they have access to cheap credit through microcredit institutions. It turns out that the benefits accrued to the gung-ho folks persist for over 6 years at least, and they keep growing every year. 6 years later, the authors find that these entrepreneurs own businesses that have 35% more assets and generate double the revenues as those in controlled neighborhoods. Therefore, it seems that for talented but low-wealth entrepreneurs, short-term access to credit can indeed facilitate escape from a poverty trap. Well, that's all for today. Thanks a lot for watching. And if you've managed to stick around for both part 1 and part 2, you are indeed a gung-ho viewer. So today we're going to be talking about macro credit. Did I just say macro credit? That's just credit. Oh boy.